Hello there guys and welcome back to the channel. Right, so it has been a while since I made a mastery video. It has been actually over a year, and the reason for it is obviously because there's absolutely nothing that changed about my masteries, and throughout the years there are very little changes about in my personal setups as well. However, I did want to utilize the fact that we still have some free mastery changes for the next couple of hours to kind of go over my three main mastery setups that I personally use for pretty much everything in the game, starting Alliance War defense, going on to arena grinding and everything else. And as I shift through my setups, I can slowly explain exactly why I make the choices that I do and why I don't select masteries that I typically stay away from, so on and so forth. So this is my standard default Liquid Courage Double Edge setup. So when I run Liquid Courage Double Edge, I also like how Max Despair and Max Deep Wounds, that is kind of going to be a common theme. Whenever possible, I do absolutely like to have those two masteries maxed, because I think Despair is one of the most versatile masteries around there and is extremely helpful, and not just when you are playing against another summoner and then can mitigate their willpower heal, but also obviously in plenty of piece of content, giving kind of heal mitigation properties to a ton of different champions. Obviously, when it comes to deep wounds, it depends which champions you run, but I absolutely love how it changes Nick Fury from being good to absolutely insane. Plus, it opens doors for more damage to champions like Carnage, also extremely important there, and several other champions. So the first three there is very basic. We have 1 point in courage, maxed out greater precision, maxed out cruelty, and when it comes to Liquid Courage Double Edge tree, it's also basically the bare minimum points to max out Liquid Courage and Double Edge. So this is my kind of standard offensive setup. Now defense pretty much always looks this. Recently I have been experimenting with a slightly different arrangement of 18 points that I'm going to go over a bit later, and that was specifically because of Battlegrounds and specific problem that I wanted to address in Battlegrounds. But this is my default defense setup that pretty much never gets changed. I do not run Coagulate, Resonate, or Inequity normally. There are times when I do activate those masteries, but that is kind of for specific reasons. This is one of the reasons why I also want the mastery presets so badly, and why I want to have access to like 5 or 6 mastery setups, because I'd absolutely love to have a mastery loadout available to me with Resonate and Inequity unlocked, because some champions just become pretty much immortal with those masteries active, and they can mitigate opponents' incoming damage so heavily. It is extremely advantageous. But basically, this is my standard defense setup, so unless I specifically point out something different, it will always look like this. Then we have our proficiencies. Whilst I'm running Liquid Courage Double Edge, as a standard, it's just max Limber and max Stupefy to have my stun duration increased as much as I can. Sorry, max parry and max Stupefy, and that is it. So this is my default Liquid Courage Double Edge setup. It's also made that way so I could quite cost efficiently transfer from my Liquid Courage Double Edge builds into my non-Liquid Courage Double Edge builds. So when I want to be free from recoil and place Alliance War defense, then we're basically recreating the steps of everything that you saw here, except we are omitting 1 point from cruelty, because cruelty and precision both are subject to diminishing returns. However, there are a lot more champion abilities these days that do trigger on critical hits, plus critical hits have the opportunity to bypass physical resistances and things like that. So in general, I think it is more important that you do crit than it is whether you crit for a slightly bigger number. So if I do have to pick in between cutting a point in one of these two, then I'm cutting a point in cruelty. So then my standard tree basically is the same, except 1 less point in cruelty. Why is that? Well, it's quite simple. It's quite simple actually, because then we can go on to maxing out Limber, and also maxing out Mystic Dispersion. And that is my standard non-Liquid Courage, non-Double Edge build. I do personally absolutely love maxed out Mystic Dispersion. I think this is quite important, and I'm going to talk about it in a second there a bit more. And then I max out my despair again. And I maxed out my deep wounds again. And this is going to be my setup for whenever I'm not running Liquid Courage Double Edge. It's not the most damage intensive setup. As you can notice, I'm not running any points in Glass Cannon, for instance. It is a mastery that I would like to have points in with this kind of configuration. But unfortunately, again, you can't get points for everything. The key here on Mystic Dispersion, why I like to have Mystic Dispersion at 5 as a default. And here is my reasoning for it. If you're using a Mystic champion against any champion that has a lot of buffs, you're going to be benefiting from it greatly, right? It doesn't matter whether you're Mystic, whether your champion is going to have MD at 3, 4, or 5. If opponent gains buff after buff, you're going to have an easy time. And then there is very little difference. When it does make quite a lot of difference is, however, if opponents gain a single buff or 2 buffs only periodically. As we can see in the information here, you get 12% of power compared to 8 as of level 4. That means at max MD level, opponent has to trigger only 2 buffs for you to gain 24% of your max power, but at level 4, it would need to be 3 buffs. It is a very noticeable difference, and it really matters in the fights that are not granted, are not given, are not guaranteed, where opponents only get 1-2 buffs occasionally. When you're facing nodes like Arc Overload, for instance, when occasionally they will be getting armor up and regeneration, right? Then it's going to make a huge, huge difference how much power you get, and those are the fights where you actually need help. Obviously, not to mention that I also use this setup typically to place my defense for most part, and MD5 obviously makes, for instance, Ebony Maw a lot scarier. So this is my non-Liquid Courage Double Edge setup. The beauty of this is, because right now at this point, it's super, super quick and easy to respec in my Liquid Courage Double Edge setup, because I have nothing to change in offense, and I can only withdraw points from my defense, from my proficiencies, go back to the 8 points here, and we have our proficiencies just how they used to be before. And then I can have enough points left over to add it back in. Glass Cannon, Recoil, Liquid Courage Double Edge. And that is also a reason why I don't touch my defense, just so I don't have, again, more units to be spent to reapply the masteries in defense every time I need changing it. And it's part of the reason why my proficiencies are typically so bare. And so at this point, I could pretty much start over again. I can add the point here. And if I want to take them off, I have to redo only my offense, and then which is the most costly part typically of this whole switcheroo. But as soon as I withdraw the points here, I can immediately go to proficiencies, set back where I used to be, and basically reapply the beginning of this as well, should I want to switch back. There is a third setup, however, that I have been running, and that setup was for Battlegrounds specifically as well, and that is also a setup that I occasionally use when I want to have Mystic Dispersion and Liquid Courage Double Edge on at the same time. Now, the key point is you can have 2 of these 3 things active at any given point. You can have Liquid Courage Double Edge and Deep Wounds, or you can have Liquid Courage Double Edge and Mystic Dispersion. You can't have all 3 of them together. So the obvious choice here is, whenever I do want to run Mystic Dispersion with Liquid Courage Double Edge, unfortunately Deep Wounds kind of have to go. But I like Despair Mastery so much that I still have managed to get 2 points in Despair. It's not quite as effective, but it still does the job quite fine. So if I want to run Mystic Dispersion with Liquid Courage Double Edge, we get up here till 4 points, and that gives us enough to start, because I still like having Limber as well, especially for Battlegrounds, because Limber does make fights trickier. And then I max out my Mystic Dispersion, because Mystic Dispersion obviously makes it harder to fight against your Mystic champions and all that other stuff. And then we're basically going to do the same startup setup here. When I was running Battlegrounds, I had no points in Courage, because most of the time, if you need to rely on Courage, you probably will have lost the match already. So I was not putting in points there at all on a on a mastery that ideally you do not want ever to activate in the first place, kind of. I'd much rather prefer something that's going to be active at all times in maxing out cruelty, even though objectively 1 point in courage in normal situations would be better. And then we have the points to put in 1 in glass cannon, 1 in recoil, and then we can go max out liquid courage, double edge in a second, and that's going to leave me with 2 points left over, which are going to go to despair. So I somehow managed to barely squeeze in 2 points in despair. I know it's not a max out despair, but I really do like having points in this mastery. And we're having max MD, we're having our willpower and everything else like normally, and we do have liquid courage double edge. Now, one thing, as I mentioned, as I said before, that we're going to circle back to is I recently have been toying with slightly different defensive setup, especially for battlegrounds. You see, physical resistance only awards you 160 points maximum amount. It's still decent, it's still helpful, it still mitigates damage a little bit every time you take a hit or every time you take a hit in a block. It's still nice to have that 160 points in physical resistance, kind of like an average situation. However, one of the problems I quickly realized in battlegrounds is if opponents running maxed limber, which most of the ones that are competitive will be, you do have really short parry stun window. And quite often it's not even long enough to properly throw heavy attack, or at the very least, if you hesitate for a moment, it's very easy to miss your heavy attack. So I altered my defense because there is actually key to countering that problem. There's key to countering that problem for specifically, let's say, alliance wars and specifically for battlegrounds, and to slightly extend your stand duration. And a lot of old school players will remember this because it was part of the strategy to gain infinite parries in Labyrinth of Legends, but it has been kind of like since neglected. So because of battlegrounds, I had adjusted my defense where I still went with max block proficiency, but I also max out my perfect block. And it's not necessarily that I want to have that 4% chance for a perfect block. It really doesn't matter all that much. And then I put in 1 in stand your ground and willpower. But the thing about perfect block chance is that it works with your parry mastery. You see, you have this 4% increase in perfect block chance. And that does still interact with parry mastery. And a lot of people have forgotten this line on parry. Well-timed block right when attack reduces damage by additional 25%. If contact is made by basic attacks inflict stun debuff for up to 1 second, stand duration is increased by up to 1 second with perfect block chance. Now, with just 4% in your perfect block mastery, you will not get a full second increase. However, you will get noticeable enough difference to let your heavies land much more consistently and give you just that bit much more time to kind of do what you're planning to do. So that is the thing, because of battlegrounds, and this also obviously works for alliance wars or anytime you really need to deal with limber mastery. Perfect block does extend the parry stand duration, and that the amount that you extend the parry stand duration also bypasses the reduction from limber because it happens after. So let's say if you had a champion that had a very high perfect block chance as is, thanks to parry stand, limber would be kind of fairly ineffective because it doesn't matter how much limber would reduce the original stand duration, that additional second that you can get due to the second part of parry would still always remain there. So that stun would be at least 1 second long, even if there would be, let's say, 100% limber active, which, is not a node, but still. So that is, again, important interaction in between parry and your perfect block chance. Some champions have built-in perfect block chance, but this mastery gives additional perfect block chance to every single one of your champions, and that will also increase your parry stand duration when dealing with limber specifically, because it does bypass limber. And that's something that I adjusted for battlegrounds that definitely has been quite helpful for me. And that's pretty much it. This is the mastery setup that I was running to get to top spot in battlegrounds as well. You do not need to run liquid courage double edge. at all. I was doing perfectly fine with my regular setup as well, but this one obviously did seem to be the most effective for me. Right, that is going to do for my mastery setup video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys kind of like heard my thoughts about it. The final bits, occasionally it is worth having access to Petrify and Pacify. There are situations for Alliance War when I do put these on, and they can be helpful. However, I do not necessarily think that, they are that helpful and that necessary most of the time. And this is, all three of these setups is basically how I play. Most of the time, if you see me running Liquid Courage Double Edge, that's going to be the very first setup you saw in the video, because I do love having max deep wounds and max despair. If I'm not running Liquid Courage Double Edge, that's going to be the second setup that you saw. And this is when I want to have Mystic Dispersion and Liquid Courage Double Edge, and this is also the setup that I was using for Battlegrounds, because a lot of people have been curious for all of that stuff. Obviously, what kind of setup I run for Battlegrounds is going to change on the node completely, because I don't think that without Masochism, having Liquid Courage Double Edge would have been a wise idea at all. But all that being said, I hope this video has been useful to you. And if it has, hit that like button, hit that sub button, hit all the good buttons. I will catch you guys soon. See ya. Hello there guys, and welcome back to the channel. So we have all the information about the